Yep, just completed my PhD at Cardiff University School of Geography and Planning. I've been researching intensive poultry developments and the mounting contestation about more of them being built in certain parts of the UK. This time last year, I gave a presentation at the CCRI Winter School, which focused on the environmental impacts of this type of intensive livestock farming. And in particular, the nutrient issues generated by the excess manures, the poultry manure. So today, there's still some pictures of chicken poo in the presentation, but I'm airing some completely different data that I collected during my research, but some of which I left out of my thesis, mainly due to just lack of space, really. But I want to write it up into a paper, and so I'd welcome some feedback at the end on what you feel about the information. So what I want to explore is that the suggestion that intensive livestock farming could damage other economic sectors, specifically tourism and leisure recreation. I mean, although this could have other impacts on other sectors, perhaps the property market and so on. I'm not going there today. Here are two introductory quotes showing the sort of polarized attitudes I uncovered about whether intensive livestock units will harm tourism. In my case, I was looking at poultry, chicken units. On the left, there is a typical attitude from the farming sector, doubting that there's any effect. It's perception rather than reality. Are visitors really going to be bothered? And on the right, a view from a rural tourism business, identifying a whole range of factors they think could affect their visitors, pointing out that these people are nature lovers, they're in search of beautiful landscapes and tranquility. But before we go into much more detail, I'll give you some background context about the poultry industry, a few more details about my research, and then focus in to consider the questions around tourism. So to put poultry farming in context, there are now 20 million chickens produced a week in the UK. That's over 1 billion a year. This makes the UK 75% self-sufficient in chicken. And that's meat chickens, not eggs at this point. People now eat over 36 kilograms of chicken each per year, compared to about 1 kilogram a year in the 1950s. And consumption continues to rise as chicken takes over. Sorry, I've gone forward a slide. Never mind. Chicken takes over from other types of meat. As you could see on the previous graph, beef and pork are much more flatlining. So most people don't come across poultry units very often. It's concentrated in certain parts of the UK, less well populated parts. I'm sorry, the slides are going forward without me doing anything. I wonder if I can go back. How does this work? Previous. Okay, I'm sorry, there may be some strange timing on one or two of the slides, which I'm not aware of. So I'm concentrating on Herefordshire, highlighted there, also Shropshire. Broiler is the term used for meat chickens. I point out that Gloucestershire is also in the mix here. It's number 10 on the graph, and these are data from Compassion in Wild Farming. Right, let's see if we can get the timings right. These are typical new intensive poultry units. Each unit or each shed contains 40 to 55,000 broiler chickens, which stay in the sheds for only about 36 to 42 days. The starting point for my research was the growing local contestation and controversy, which sometimes hit national headlines as well as local. I was trying to unravel the networks of people involved in the arguments over planning applications for new IPUs and explore their values, concerns, and how they experience the existing units. This particular article is about a case. It harks back to the rural idyll. I think Janet Dwyer was drawn in to review the economic impact estimates that the campaign group had prepared in this case. The applications were actually refused, mainly on landscape grounds, although I think the farmer did eventually get permission for an intensive pig unit. So my research used a threefold theoretical approach. starting with ANT, relational approach, from work such as Michel Callan's Acting in an Uncertain World, which focuses on starting from the point of a controversy and a contestation. Jonathan Murdoch's post-structural geography was really useful. He looks at planning, the environment, food and farming through a post-structural lens. But then I linked in pragmatism, particularly several authors who have linked the two frameworks together, like Owen Jones, Notcher, Mares, and Gary Bridge, who argue that the conceptual approaches create synergy with pragmatism, particularly focusing on the questions around what should be done, what action is required in a particular situation. And I enriched the research and made it more complicated in some ways by linking in phenomenology, using experiential, multisensory, embodied and mobile methodologies with work by Sarah Pink and the other authors there. So this sort of hybrid approach also led to a hybrid methodology, a mixture of documentary analysis, interviews and ethnography. In terms of ethnography, I did walking interviews and solo walks, which helped bring out many of the multisensory ways in which IPUs, intensive poultry units, are encountered in the landscape. And this photo here demonstrates the fact that actually rights of way go straight through some of these units. The units were built on top of existing legal rights of way. And so you do get to walk alongside or even through some units. At the bottom there, I've highlighted two surveys I did in Northwest Herefordshire, which I didn't in the end include in the thesis, but I want to sort of bring out some of the results today. I'm not aware that anyone has tried to research this sort of issue in the UK before, so your comments and suggestions would be really welcome. And I should at this point perhaps just clarify my personal standpoint. I'm not vegan. I'm not approaching this from an animal welfare perspective, although obviously those issues do emerge in the research at times. So these maps show the change in Herefordshire between 2000 on the left and 2017 on the right. The size of the blobs reflects just the number of sheds at each location. The pink are the broiler blobs. The total number of sheds has risen from about 350 in 2000 to over 600 now. And the sheds are all about twice the size that they were. Sorry, I'm just going to go back again. They've grown, the sheds, individual sheds have grown in size. So the number of birds has doubled in numbers between those 2 years. And I should point out that the main chicken processing company, Cargill in this case, is located in Hereford. Cargill, which has now formed a joint venture called Avara, supplies companies such as McDonald's, Nando's, Asda, Lidl, Tesco. This graph plots the number of sheds given planning permission each year, the blue, and those refused, which is the orange. Some applications were just for 1 shed, others for up to 6. There have been in total 173 separate applications since 2000, of which only 8 were refused. So tourism is one of the most regularly voiced concerns. When I analysed several cases, tourism came in about 3rd place, roughly speaking, as the top reasons cited for objecting. It's the in-combination impacts of all the other aspects, really, which people perceive will harm the tourism industry. I should say that some of the photos I'm using today come from Shropshire as well as Herefordshire. This unit's in the Shropshire Hills AONB. And here are just a couple of quotes from my interviews backing up that tourism and intensive livestock. People perceive it just doesn't mix well. This was a local government decision maker saying it seems pretty obvious. And this is an environmental officer who actually gave me the title for this seminar. She was the one that described on their half-hour journey to work each morning, they could sometimes smell chicken manure along the whole of their route to work, and said tourists just don't want to smell that. So looking at the planning side of things, when the applications come to planning committee, the planning officers, many of the local councillors making the decisions, tend to ignore and deny the concerns around tourism. Excuse me. I heard multiple times that there's just no evidence of tourism impacts from IPUs. Some planning officers rolled the tourism concerns up into sort of general impacts on the local community and gave them no particular consideration. Others actually said to me they thought it was a legitimate concern, but without firm scientific evidence, they would not be able to defend such an argument. And they knew they might end up in court for a planning appeal, having to defend their recommendations. Local councillors, the decision makers, tended to ignore the tourism evidence. They tend to make the case for development based on national need for more chicken, the economic benefits from the development, and the multiple scientific reports which state that IPUs are unlikely to cause much pollution and noise and smell. There's lots of information about that in my thesis, but I want to stick to the tourism aspects today. So one of the things I was testing was if the environmental arguments were failing to gain any purchase in the planning system, was there an economic case to make? Is there scope to tackle the neo-productivist arguments head on and argue that rather than boosting the local economy, that actually these intensive farming units might be damaging the economy and damaging tourism and recreation? A few academics have looked at this. There was one exception, was Nick Evans's study of intensive strawberry production, also as it happens in Herefordshire, where campaigners against the tunnels used tourism as an argument. But Evans appeared relatively sceptical about it. So let's have a look. This is the point where if we were all in the same room together, I'd probably stop and ask people what do they think of when they think of Herefordshire, what comes to mind? And here's some comments that came out of some of my research. And I put the responses from the visitor survey into a word cloud, and you can see how countryside scenery, the black and white villages, such as this one here in Pembridge, came out of all the comments that were people made during the survey. Other things are cider, hops, mistletoe, beef, apples, the woodland streams and wildlife, unspoilt farmed historic landscapes in effect. The quality of the environment and the outdoor experiences it offers, particularly walking, has been one of the main promotional messages. Hereford is called the rural city at times. But it's this rural nature of tourism locally and how it's founded on the images of a traditional farming landscape and community is partly why intensive farming is creating such a dissonance. This is how the county's been promoted in the past and more recently on the right. Note how food, animals, countryside are heavily featured in that Herefordshire Guide cover there. And it's perhaps useful to point out at this stage that tourism is economically more significant to the county in terms of income and in terms of employment than agriculture. Even if you add in the food manufacturing in the chicken processing plants, tourism employs more people, generates more gross added value, but it's dominated mainly by small companies and there's very few large hotels or chains. The county is very dependent on repeat visits from people who appreciate the peace, the tranquility, the slow pace of life. So let's turn to some of the tourism business data. This was an online tourism business survey. I had about 50 responses, which was actually a third response rate of the number of tourism businesses in the northwest part of Herefordshire, or at least those with an email address, which is by no means all. They said the types of people who visit rural Herefordshire, the older couples, families during holidays, but independent people organising their holidays themselves or their days out, their weekends away. And there is a younger market around more outdoor activities such as things like mountain biking. The graph there shows what the businesses said their visitors were interested in. And you can see things like scenery, landscape, walking, heritage and nature are really popular. And in contrast, shopping is much, much lower than it would be in other areas. The business survey revealed significant concern about intensive poultry units. I asked them about, before I mentioned what I was interested in specifically, I asked them about a range of large-scale rural developments that have caused concern in the area. And you can see from this graph that far more people were concerned about the poultry units than about polytunnels, wind farms or solar farms. And bear in mind that a couple of the respondents to this business survey not only ran a tourism business, but also ran a poultry farm. So there's at least a couple of people in there that were giving the more positive answers along the way with this survey. I asked what aspects of each type of development concerned or worried the respondents. And I mean, as you can see, they were worried about all of it really, but perhaps the highest concerns were around water pollution, smell, traffic, landscape impacts. And here you again see poultry that in yellow were the least desirable developments as potential neighbours. I think I defined near as within about a mile. And just to pick out some comments, many mentioned the smell, additional heavy traffic, noise impacts. About 5 people mentioned animal welfare issues, and there were a mixture of other issues raised. And then when I asked more specifically about existing poultry units close to people, again, smell came out strongly. I think the comment there, just knowing that they're there is horrible, is interesting, as it demonstrates it's not just what you can see, hear and smell, but actually there's some sort of emotional elements as well. And I find that final comment expressing bewilderment particularly interesting, almost poignant. So the survey went further to ask a hypothetical question about whether they thought their turnover would be likely to be impacted if a new poultry unit were to be built within a mile of their business. And you can see there's a mix of views, quite an even split really between those saying yes and no to this question. But some, such as the poultry farm owner at the top, denying that there's any impacts at all from her enormous poultry operation on her quite upmarket self-catering operation. But some were worried about repeat business, and then there were some specifics about how negative reviews could be harmful. And one there identifying a clash between the type of food they served at their bed and breakfast and the food being raised in the landscape. A few further reflections from businesses. They're criticising local authorities, bemoaning how tourism businesses don't seem to get the same sort of support as agricultural ones. And at the bottom right there, one pub landlord mentions the fact that farmers don't pay business rates on their intensive poultry units, and making the contrast with his own pub business. So I'll move on. I'm moving quite swiftly here, just to remind you, this is being recorded. So if I'm going too fast, you can go back and have a look at a later date for some of the information. But I just quickly wanted to run through a few of the results from the actual visitor survey. Visitors are really important actors in the situation, but it's really difficult to hear their voices about an issue like this one. And that's why I trialed this survey. I used this postcard and on the reverse it directed people to an online survey. I had almost exactly the same number of responses, around 50, but 50 visitors during the whole, it was 2018 when I did both surveys. It's a tiny snapshot from the total visitors to the area that year. I could email the businesses direct, but you know, this was much more challenging. However, I do have confidence that the characteristics of the sample are not wildly different from the typical visitor revealed in previous visitor surveys. But I suppose I should bear in mind that those people picking up a postcard like this might well be attuned to landscape issues and caring about those sorts of issues more than the average visitor. But this is the first time such an exercise has been tried, and I thought it was just interesting to see what sort of data it produced. So after a number of introductory questions, I asked whether visitors had seen any of these developments. And you can see the yes, no's there, and polytunnels are fairly obvious in the landscape. But I was interested because quite a lot of farming sector people said, well, visitors don't even know what those sheds are. They won't know, they won't recognise them, they won't care. And actually, this seemed to reveal that people had seen and knew what they were, or at least half of them had noticed poultry units. And in terms of level of concern, there's a clear picture that wind turbines, solar farms cause concern for only maybe a quarter of respondents. For polytunnels, it was definitely higher. But for chicken units, the figure was 83% who were either somewhat concerned or very concerned. I had wondered whether businesses, previous research into things like wind farms has found that businesses may overestimate how concerned their visitors are, but this seems to suggest that visitors do notice and they are concerned. Here are some just general comments that came out from the visitors. Landscape, traffic, smell, economic aspects are all identified. And I thought the point about the sort of density and intensity of the units is very significant. I asked the visitors a hypothetical question as well. If they were to find an IPU close to their accommodation, would they be concerned? 80% said yes, maybe that's to be expected. And then I asked an open question about how would they respond or feel. And these were just some of the things that people said, you know, they'd feel upset, but some of them were actually talking about asking for a refund or that they'd post a negative review online. The survey revealed that some visitors perceive this dissonance with the green, unspoiled image that they have of Herefordshire. The picture that emerges from the results is reasonable levels of awareness. This may have been skewed by the nature of the sample, but equally the type of people who visit rural Herefordshire are most likely to be the ones that value deeply rural areas. They come regularly, so they probably do notice change more. And they may not go back to a particular place if they feel it's been spoiled for them, and that in time that might mean they don't come back to Herefordshire at all. There's certainly much in the survey that would worry tourism businesses located close to poultry units or proposed poultry units. So I've pulled together a summary of what the interviews and observations revealed, rather than going through that in too much detail. In terms of the interviews, I spoke to 14 people from the farming sector and 14 from the tourism sector, and there were 2 people who fall into both of those categories. On the left-hand side there, you've got the farming sector perspectives, denying that there'd been an impact or that visitors would notice or care about the IPUs. And just to point out, it was interesting that there's relatively few farm-based tourism businesses currently. There are some with some of these large self-catering units, but I think farmhouse B&B has reduced, and farm-based campsites, there's a handful. But even some people from the farming sector commented that that rural tourism business, things like glamping, are normally run by income downshifters, or people have bought up large country houses to set up wedding venues and things like that. But a lot of them are not actual farm businesses that are running these sorts of things. This is just a quote from, I contacted a specific business, a caravan campsite close to a new poultry unit that had been built in 2018. So I contacted them in 2019 while I was writing up. And online, there's no evidence of issues, reviews and things. There's mainly positive reviews of his campsite. But when I actually contacted him, because I'd met him previously, I received almost this whole diatribe focusing on the problems they'd had connected to flies from the IPU, which was just a few hundred yards away. I thought it's revealing that although there's no public evidence of what appears to be quite a significant problem for them, and also note the reference in there to they were beginning to think about whether to move, possibly shutting the business completely. And again, the B&B in the same hamlet had also had to close, at least temporarily. So there were multiple references to economic impacts. And so there is perhaps potential for challenging the agricultural neo-productivist arguments about the value of intensive poultry to the area. There again, this quote just highlighting the dissonance. And a final quote here, which I feel is quite evocative. The smell of intensively farmed chickens wafting above their locally brewed ale. So there are the beginnings of evidence, I suppose, is my argument. But is there enough to convince the local councillors on the planning committee? You know, I think that's another matter.
Alison, just to say you've got 10 minutes left.
That's great. I think I'm on time. Thank you. So why are tourism impacts denied or dismissed? And there's some quotes there, more quotes there on the right. The first one, a tourism business that had been objecting to a local, a new proposal for a further IPU in their village, and then two more tourism voices. Most visitors are reluctant to complain, particularly about things like horrible smells. I think for most people, complaining spoils the experience. You know, they're on holiday, they probably know their hosts aren't responsible, nothing can be done about it, and perhaps they even fear that they're going to look like stupid urban types complaining about countryside smells. So often you don't hear the visitors. They may notice, but they may not say anything. They're more likely to simply vote with their feet and not come back. So one perspective that came out strongly was this issue of silence, a lack of information about how visitors really feel about what they experience. And from the tourism sector, a lot of them are also feeling silenced because the threat of having online negative reviews putting future visitors off is really very real for them. One objector said, voicing their fears for the tourist trade in the area, bad news travels fast, especially on social media. The trade organisations are very weak with very few staff or resources. Over the last 10 years, they've had most of their resources completely removed, and some of them, I mean, Herefordshire really doesn't have a tourism organisation anymore. And they're also reluctant to take on something like intensive farming, which could backfire on them. So lack of institutional support for tourism. The local enterprise partnership was being criticised by a number of the tourism actors. Some small local groups do remain to keep things like tourist information going, but they're very small, they're fragmented, they're parochial really, and they're not going to speak up against such a controversial issue. Although it's meant to be a priority with the local enterprise partnership, you can see from these quotes that they've done very little for tourism in recent years. There's no tourism actors on its board. It prioritises manufacturing, including food manufacturing and intensive meat. So either by design or by default, the voices that speak for tourism in the county tend to be farming voices. And those voices will not speak out against intensive livestock. So I began to think of what was happening as almost a colonisation of other rural sectors by the farming sector. Lowe et al. Used the term colonisation in their classic study of farming and pollution in Devon in 1997. The farming sector by default, or it's occupied the organisational vacuums and weaknesses, and they use their positions to argue for intensive farming or for business as usual. They police any criticism. The processing company performs power in maybe more covert ways with the authorities and through targeted public relations activities. Cargill, I've heard people talk about the Hereford Times, the local newspaper. They call it the Cargill Times, or they used to. It's always full of photos of sponsored football matches, rugby matches, arts things, charitable events, and so on. So the quote here illustrates an example of the dynamics within the tourism sector, with some of the farming interests occupying key tourism positions. Weak local authorities and environmental agencies, they're just unable to handle such polarised, such contested situations, and they tend to avoid the issue, or they displace action, or they deny there's a problem at all. There were some examples of public sector officers trying to resist, but some of them actually suffered career consequences as a result, and some of them have just moved on because they found their position quite awkward. So to try and pull things together into some conclusions, I think the research has revealed power relations, here focusing on the intertwined tourism and farming interests, an example of how power relations are being enacted. And in this particular instance with tourism, the dynamics just mean it's really hard to capture the evidence for this. Tourism voices are either too scared or they've been colonised, and the dominant local narratives just continue to prioritise agricultural concerns, and they normalise intensive livestock units. There are, the power relations are shifting a little bit. Other voices are being heard a little bit more in the last few years. Here are some examples of media coverage, all from 2020, of where campaigners have been gaining some more purchase, successfully challenging several planning applications, and also these arguments here about poultry units causing river pollution. Oh, sorry, I've got the same issue going on. These are all articles, yeah, from last year, from national and local papers. So finally, I think I've broken a bit of new ground by gathering views from businesses and visitors about what is quite a difficult topic. The evidence is a bit fragmentary, but it does suggest that the types of people who visit the area do care about intensive farming and its impacts. But there are many silent voices, or voices that are actively policed or suppressed. I've tried to trace the relationships within Herefordshire, the actors and organisations, and identified that farming voices dominate. Food and farming, although they're important elements of tourism in Herefordshire, food and farming are now dominating almost to the exclusion of more mainstream tourism interests. And I thought I'd just finish with a few pragmatic thoughts about potential responses. This is just purely on the tourism, recreation, leisure elements of the work. I've got many, many more recommendations on the other aspects of the situation and planning processes. Currently, although detailed scientific reports are done on many aspects in the planning process, there's very, very rarely done an economic impact assessment done. And that would be a simple thing to address. And amenity, I mean, amenity is meant to be one of the things that they look at with rights of way. And yet one of the planning officers said to me that is never actually looked at, although it is in the legislation. And amenity in terms of the quality of life of local people and of regular visitors and so on. You know, this access to the countryside and fresh air and relaxation is very important and does tend to be demoted. So I'm suggesting that broader, my sort of broader recommendations are that the planning processes need to be clearer about what is known and what is uncertain. They need to be a bit more transparent about all the evidence and listen to more voices. They need to be a bit braver in making decisions and think about the ethical aspects rather than just focusing on the scientific environmental reports about odour, about the noise and the more scientific aspects. So I think they should focus a bit more on what would be best for the whole area, more strategically, their communities and people's lives. And of course, I've only just scratched the surface with this research, so there's scope for lots more research. So please do ask questions. I'd welcome comments. I'll be revisiting all this in the next few weeks because I'm wanting to write up a paper on this. So please, I'd welcome any comments and so on now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alison, and perfect timing as well. We've got a whole host of questions popping up in the chat box. I'm not sure if Katerina, you've managed to synthesize any of them yet. There's one starting with Keith, I think. It's the very first question.
Yes.
I'll pass over to you, Katerina.
Yes, that's all right. So there are a number of questions and several comments, which maybe Alison you can look at afterwards, because there are also some sort of interesting debate going on. But the first question is from Keith. To what extent did the IPUs impact visitors' access to the countryside overall, and to the quiet reflective spaces in particular? So sort of it's about the quality of rural experience, really.
Cool. Hi, Keith. Nice to see you. They don't prevent access in that they're not normally, although some of them are built on top of rights of way, the rights of way have had to be diverted around them. So you can still do those walks. It's really the experience that people have as they're walking past. And I've written several pages about how they tend to be surrounded by CCTV cameras and wire fences and big signs, and you get quite worried about biosecurity issues and should you actually be there. And that's before you talk about the farmers that may have blocked some of the rights of way and that sort of thing. So I think they do affect the experience, although they're not at this point, at least, you know, actually blocking any actual rights of way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Charlotte, you had a couple of questions, so perhaps do you want to ask some of those? Charlotte? Okay.
I was on mute, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I've been on Zoom for like a year and I still can't. Brilliant. Yeah, so Alison, I have so many questions. A lot of them would probably go back to the environmental side of things more, but yeah, I mean, I did kind of wonder whether tourists would sort of see there's an IPU locally, but if the price of your accommodation was right, would they then sort of be willing to overlook it almost? Not something that I'm pro, obviously. I don't like these IPUs. And I also wondered about the sort of farmer side of things. So I've had some farmers say, you know, I'm starting to want to use more poultry muck instead of fertilizers and things, but they can't get hold of it. So have you had any farmers say that they're sort of, they find it quite useful having a nearby IPU? Sorry, it's not particularly related to tourism side, but I'm just
that's fine. The pricing, I mean, my research hasn't gone as far. I mean, that would be something you could follow up if you looked at this a bit more and talked to people and sort of looked at the hypothetical situation. I mean, the thing is, a lot of these self-catering in rural areas like this, they're not cheap, a lot of them. And even if you're camping, I mean, I got caught out one evening. It was a lovely summer 2018, and we went and camped somewhere and were cooking a meal one evening, and suddenly I could smell this terrible smell. And, you know, and I thought, oh no, my research is following me even on holiday. And, you know, you can't actually escape something like that. And until there was a bit of a breeze blew up about 3 or 4 hours later, we were sitting there with this smell on the campsite. And, you know, and we only paid about $5 or something to stay there, but you were still affected. So I'm not sure about the pricing side. The manure issues we can talk about at length at some point. The amount that the numbers, I did an estimate on the amount of additional poultry manure that's being produced in this region, so Shropshire, Herefordshire and Powys. There's a big issue in Powys as well. And it's absolutely vast, and there's a lot of discussion around the fact that farmers are over applying it, and a lot of it is going to anaerobic digestion. There's a lot of AD units on these farms, and they're making quite a bit of their income from the AD units, the energy, the subsidies related to all the energy side of things. So it's quite a major topic, which I think maybe we park at the moment, and we'll talk about later.
We'll talk about it later, definitely.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is another interesting question from Damien, who is asking is whether you know what's the balance regarding tourism and farming contribution to the local economy.
Yep, hi Damien. Yeah, if I remember correctly, employment-wise, I think agriculture's, this is Herefordshire, purely Herefordshire. Agriculture is 0.5% of employment and tourism's over 10%. It's quite difficult because the stats aren't, you know, don't help. But if you added in the food manufacturing, it would increase, you know, on that side, but it's not as much as tourism. The economic impact is not quite so stark as the employment side of things, but tourism is still much more dominant in terms of the economic impact, although it hasn't been measured for the last 5 years. But certainly the historic data is that tourism is more important. It's just much more fragmented.
Thank you very much. And there is also an interesting question from Julie Urquhart, which sort of sparked further discussion in the chat. Did you come across issues in planning where proposals were approved because the planners didn't want the expense of challenging an appeal if they refuse an application?
Yeah, definitely.
I've noted that most of the applications were approved.
Most of the applications were approved. In Herefordshire, there were some planning officers who got quite expert at looking at some of the reports, and they became more and more skilled at digesting it and understanding it. And they began to challenge and recommend refusal on a number of applications. And there were 1 or 2, therefore, that the councillors went along with that and refused, and they went to appeal. People almost inevitably go to appeal because the application has cost so much money. So I don't think the appeal costs very much, if anything. Anyway, they go to appeal, and a number of them then won on appeal, and the costs were awarded against the council. I've heard, don't quote me, but there was one case just north of Hereford where I think the cost to the council was something like £80,000. Shropshire's run into all sorts of legal costs with judicial reviews with cases there. I think we're over £100,000, many times that perhaps in Shropshire. So councils are very cautious because of those consequences of getting their decisions wrong when challenged.
Thank you very much. Theo, you had a number of questions, so perhaps if you can sort of link those together and ask a couple of them. Theo?
Yes, I'll try to. Can you hear me correctly?
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you've identified anything that explains such a development in Herefordshire of the poultry business compared to other areas. And as well, I wanted to ask on whether you had a look at the MAC management or different MAC managements, or that might impact differently on smell, noise, and as well impact on environment, water course, etc., and being differently beneficial to crops. Whether you had you investigated whose, yeah, and I'm just one thing that I wanted to check that I'm not sure about is the fact that people know when it is a poultry unit, and this I was wondering whether you whether in your survey, online survey, you had kind of asked people whether, you know, how to know that it's really a poultry unit or it's not a cattle shed with a cake bin by the size, by the side.
That's interesting.
It's
Okay,
it's a lot. Sorry.
no, I've written them down. Why Herefordshire? It tends to be that the parts of the country where there's more of the intensive livestock, particularly the poultry, is it has to, in theory, it has to be within about an hour's drive of the processing plant. And so you've got in fact, I think there's 2 plants in Hereford, and historically the industry grew up here in Herefordshire and Shropshire from 100 years or so ago, and the plants are there. So not every IPU is within an hour's drive of its processing plant, but the majority are. So it's history and geography there. The management issues, I'm not quite sure I'm picking up right, but certainly there has been work done. Applicants are finding it more difficult to get their proposals through because they're getting challenged more and more year by year. So they are looking, they have been looking at what I would call technical fixes to try and minimise the various impacts. One of the most obvious one is the ammonia impact on biodiversity locally, and the current applications that are going in, quite a few of them have proposed that they're going to put ammonia scrubbers in the ventilation fans on top of the chicken sheds to scrub out much of the ammonia so that the biodiversity doesn't get harmed so much. But these are expensive, something like £100,000 per shed. So people don't do it unless they're forced to. And there are other sort of those sorts of technical fixes, which it's, to be honest, that they're using, that they resort to those when when required, perhaps in discussion with the planning officers. Do people know their chicken sheds? That's an interesting question. I didn't ask, I wasn't in a situation where I could say, here's a picture, what do you think that is? But it came up quite regularly, and I mulled it over myself, and I decided that they don't look like barns. They don't look agricultural. Many people talked about, they just look industrial. They look like they should be on an industrial estate or something. And it's something to do with the number of silos. It's something to do with the row of fans along the top. It's something to do with the construction and the height. You do get huge big barns in the countryside, but they they do seem more agricultural somehow. That's not a very scientific response, but that was what was coming out of talking to people, that they just look different. You've then got the smell, you've got a humming noise that you can hear maybe half a mile or more away, and the whole thing just looks rather different from a large traditional agricultural operation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Alison. So we have a question from Justin, who seems to have a holiday business very near a poultry farm.
Oh gosh.
And the question is whether putting pressure on the large shops like Tesco, where the chicken goes, wouldn't be a way forward.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, my research didn't stretch as far as the retailers and the restaurant chains and so on. I mean, I suspect a lot of the power in these power relations rests with those large corporations. But because I was focusing on just the planning side, looking at it through a planning lens, then they didn't really come into the equation. But in terms of consumer demand, then absolutely. There's just recently been a little bit of flurry of interest on a people may have seen in the newspapers a few weeks ago about pressure being brought on Tesco's, I think it was particularly to do with the soya imported to feed the chickens. And some journalists had made quite a big spread over the sustainability of this and the deforestation in Brazil. and they followed the soya from Brazil all the way to Liverpool and then down to Hereford. And actually there seemed to be a little bit of a flurry of, well, can consumers start influencing supermarkets to avoid using chicken that is fed with Brazilian soya. So there's definitely potential for that. It's a little bit beyond the scope of my own research, is all I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Bryony, do you want to sort of, you didn't have a question, but you're looking at it from the sort of Welsh point of view. Would you like to sort of maybe ask Alison a question about the tourism and the balance with the farming sector? Bryony?
Doesn't have a...
Oh, okay, doesn't matter. So she just commented from the sort of Welsh point of view that from her interviews in the local authority, a lot of the interest in IPUs comes from a sense that there is a limited alternative economic development opportunities in the area, and tourism is seen as important, but there is also an awareness that tourism infrastructures are underdeveloped, so expanding the industry would be challenging. Is there a sort of similar views?
I mean, from my perspective, I've been certainly monitoring the situation in Powys, although I restricted geographically my area just for practical reasons. And certainly there was a talk of I looked at the motivations from the farmers as to why they go into doing poultry, and it was a real mix, but those in the more upland areas, and particularly I think in Powys, someone described it as the desperation factor, that they don't have so many alternatives. And a lot of the units in upland areas are smaller. They're often free-range egg units. Now, that's not to say there's not problems associated with them, not least the fact that the chickens are outdoors some of the time, and therefore you get more nutrients rushing, going into local streams and things. So I think there's more, in some ways, there's sometimes more sympathy with those farmers, but that doesn't mean to say there aren't lots of objections because of landscape issues or pollution issues, or the fact that they're on tiny little rural roads and the traffic access is really difficult. So they're not less contentious, but I'd certainly say, you know, the motivations are different. I think in Herefordshire, I would say those are the minority. Most of the farms were quite big, quite wealthy. Some of the applications were purely speculative from people who didn't even own the land previously. So it does vary a lot.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And maybe we have time for one more question. Janet, you had several sort of remarks. Would you like to maybe?
No, it's fine. I didn't have a specific question. I think Alison's work is excellent and really fills a gap in respect of this this whole area of public debate, which is really valuable. And I would just hope that we can you should continue to probe it further, because so many of these issues, it is about getting a holistic picture, and at the moment the picture is very partial when decisions are made, and that is an issue.
No, thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Alison. You've prompted a lot of queries and questions there. That's an excellent seminar. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Just a little plug for our seminar next month in February on the 11th. Some couple of livestock researchers from Innovation for Agriculture are going to be talking about fostering learning and knowledge exchange in UK livestock communities, shifting hearts and minds. So look out for the website for details of that and sign up to that. So meanwhile, thank you very much again to Alison and everybody for participating.
Well done, Alison. Very good.
Great. Goodbye, folks.